Next item of business, which is questions to the First Minister. Question number 1, Ian Gray.
To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Well, I've been speaking to Jorge Calvi, the chairman of Gamesa, the world's third largest manufacturer of wind turbines. In half an hour's time, Mr. Calvi, Senior Calvi, will be announcing that Gamesa intend to establish a research and development centre in the city of Glasgow, creating 130 jobs, and furthermore are going to sign memorandums of understanding with Scottish Enterprise, with Forth Ports, with Dundee City, for their intention to establish a manufacturing and organisation and maintenance base in the city of Dundee. I know that the whole chamber will welcome this benefit to the Scottish economy.
Ian Gray.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government were caught red-handed this week doctoring evidence on Scotland's economic future. They took this quote from an academic paper, but then changed the words so that it means something else. Could the First Minister tell the Parliament who doctored this evidence and on whose authority? First Minister.
Well, I suggest if Ian Gray is going to hold things up, he gets bigger writing so that people can see it. I think this is Ian Gray's first question which could be related to the Scottish economy since last September, and basically it boils down to his objection to the insertion of a square bracket explaining what fiscal devolution means, i.e. the proportion of revenue and expenditure devolved. Now, when I was studying punctuation and parenthesis, I was told a square bracket was where you put in a point of explanation. But if Ian Gray's objection to getting real economic powers for this Parliament and this country boils down to his objection, following the lead of Wendy Alexander, to a square bracket, then I think the Labour Party has finally come to the end of its rope.
Order. Ian Gray.
No, Presiding Officer, when I studied English at school, if you took a quote and changed the words in it, it wasn't a quote anymore. The First Minister cannot just dismiss this. The Scottish Government used this doctored evidence in their draft budget. They published it in their policy paper on financing Scotland. It was the centrepiece of Alex Salmond's speech to his own SNP conference. But it just isn't true. Will he admit now that it just isn't true?
First Minister.
Well, the quote is from Professors Andrew Hughes-Hallett and Drew Scott. And, of course, they stand by their analysis that fiscal devolution means, and I quote, the impact of devolving both spending and tax powers. Now, if the authors of the quotation agree with the Scottish Government that that is an acceptable description of what fiscal devolution means, and let me repeat for Ian Gray's information, that means when Scotland has power over both its spending and its ability to raise revenue, then why on earth is Ian Gray objecting to it? The substance of this argument is as follows: that the committee, dominated by the Unionist parties, refused to examine the Scotland Bill proposals because they know there is a deflationary bias which would have cost Scotland either £8 billion, according to the Scottish Government, or £700 million, according to the Scotland Office. The Unionist Scotland Office and the independence-seeking Scottish Government agree that the proposals in the Scotland Bill, if applied over the last 10 years, would have cost Scotland many hundreds, if not billions of pounds of revenue. The only disagreement is how much Scotland would have been disadvantaged by. So therefore, how on earth can a committee justify not examining something which they are meant to be scrutinising, which could be of great damage to the Scottish economy? And how can Ian Gray, when we should all be seeking to benefit employment in Scotland, come along and ask me about a square bracket?
Order. Ian Gray.
Presiding Officer, the committee examined the evidence. The evidence was found wanting. The First Minister told us this week that as a boy soprano he had a range of 4 octaves. I was impressed I was impressed. Pavarotti could only manage 2.5, although I believe Julie Andrews has 4 octaves as well. But that is nothing. But that is nothing to how far the First Minister...
Order. Mr Gray.
But that is nothing to how far the First Minister will stretch the truth to try and make his case for independence. The First Minister told SNP Conference, we know, thanks to the work of Andrews Hughes Hallett and Drew Scott, that with economic powers we could grow the Scottish economy 1% a year. But the professors did not say that. And they still don't say that. It is not true. Did the First Minister misspeak, or did he mislead his own party?
First Minister.
I'm sure the whole chamber is mystified, as we are week on week, by Ian Gray, but I suppose the great mystery is why is someone with his magnetic personality as yet to be invited on to Desert Island Disc? But I've been thinking and wondering, what would Ian Gray's selection be if he ever got invited on that programme? How about
Order.
The Clash? Or That'll Be the Day by Buddy Holly? Can I just point out to Ian Gray that if Hughes Hallett and Professor Scott are correct and you get to a 1.3 increase in GDP, that means you have a 1.3 increase in Scottish overall wealth every year after getting economic and financial powers. But I've been absolutely fascinated. Ian Gray seems to believe that the committee has been examining the Scotland Bill. That's about the only subject that Wendy Alexander refuses to talk about. Time after time, Professor Scott and Hughes Hallett said, can we comment on our evidence? But Wendy Alexander, as convener of the committee, didn't want to talk about it. Why not? Because it has a deflationary bias that will cost every person in Scotland money. That's why the Labour Party don't want to talk about legislation they're intending to support. And in contrast, economic powers will bring Scotland wealth and prosperity.
Ian Gray.
Frankly, Presiding Officer, the longer the First Minister spends on a desert island, the better for Scotland. Leadership.
Order.
Leadership is a question of character, of trust and of judgment. If you take a piece of disputed research and you then doctor it to mean something else, and you then embellish it and multiply the figures up to suit your argument, how can you be trusted? And if you then base your vision of Scotland's future on that edifice of nonsense, what does that say about your judgment? And when you're caught out, if you won't put your hands up and admit it, what does that say about your character? Will the First Minister now republish his budget and take this doctored evidence out?
First Minister.
All right, let's deal with 3 points. First, Professors Hughes Hallett and Drew Scott, the authors of the analysis, said in The Scotsman on 19th of January 2011 that their figures were based on the impact of devolving both spending and tax powers. Fiscal devolution, fiscal autonomy, fiscal responsibility, independence over the economy as we understand it. Secondly, of course, the argument made by some members of the committee, and I recognise one of them sitting over there, in this Labour-Tory alliance, was that Professor Feld didn't argue about the devolving of both revenue and expenditure. The trouble is that he cited, and the committee cited, only a part of the quote from Professor Feld's evidence. I have the full quote before me. It goes on to say, and I quote, without square brackets, decentralisation of taxes and spending leads to a more efficient public sector and it enhances economic performance. Enhancing economic performance is increasing economic growth. Increasing economic growth is increasing prosperity for the Scottish people.
Order.
If you can increase economic growth, as Professor Hughes Hallett and Drew Scott argue, then you increase wealth and prosperity and employment in Scotland. If we are led by the Unionist parties into the Tory trap of reduced Scottish spending, a deflationary bias in the Scotland Bill proposals, then we face 10 to 15 years of progressive cutbacks in Scotland. That is why when it comes to the decision, people will vote for growth and real powers for this Parliament and for this country.